For years, Europe's coast seemed armored by Hitler's promise. No enemy force could cross the Atlantic, not with all modern technology, not with the greatest fleet ever seen. It was the Great Wall that separated the occupied continent from the Allies' ambitions, a gigantic project of nearly 2,800 kilometers, from northern Norway to the border with Spain. Concrete, steel, mines, naval guns, and thousands of men distributed in casemates, bunkers, and observation posts, all connected by military roads, designed for a single objective: to stop a landing before it began. Hitler himself said that if an invasion was halted in the first 24 hours, the war would be won. German engineering designed structures so heavy that some bunkers would withstand even naval artillery. Propaganda insisted on the image of an invincible fortress, built brick by brick to remind the world that the Reich knew how to turn fear into architecture. But there was a detail that no one saw in the maps and blueprints of the defense. The wall was never a continuous line, never as strong as its myth. It depended not only on concrete and cannons, but on fundamental strategic assumptions, and all of them were about to crumble when time, enemy intelligence, and German arrogance combined against it. What seemed impenetrable would begin to fail, not in the moment of battle, but years earlier, in the very moment it was conceived. Because no fortress is stronger than its decisions, no map is more solid than its errors, and no wall is eternal when enemies learn to think like the architect. The origin of the Atlantic Wall did not emerge as a unified plan, and that was already a warning of weakness. Contrary to what many imagine, there was no master document, no single engineer or general leading the project from the start. What there was fear. Fear of a second front. Fear of repeating 1914. Fear of the inevitable Allied landing. The German command began reinforcing ports and strategic positions in 1940, shortly after defeating France. But the project grew in an improvised way, changing as the war changed. Some sections received gigantic fortifications, armed with 155mm and 210mm cannons capable of reaching ships kilometers away. Others received only barbed wire and sentry posts. The wall was not uniform. It was the consequence of political priorities and limited resources. The myth began to be built when Goebbels' propaganda saw the psychological potential. A defensive line that threatened any Allied commander daring to cross the English Channel. Maps were published, photos were released, and newspapers announced, "The Atlantic is sealed." But there was a more serious problem. A project so vast needed a single brain, and it would only arrive too late. In 1942, after the German defeat in North Africa, Adolf Hitler finally realized that the invasion was not a distant hypothesis. He appointed Field Marshal Erwin Rommel to reorganize the wall. Rommel knew better than anyone the price of ignoring the enemy. He knew the Allies were learning from every battle, that their industrial power was growing at a speed impossible to match. And when he walked along the French coast, he saw what others lacked the courage to admit. The wall was not ready. It was not strong enough. It was not deep enough. It was not fast enough. And perhaps it never would be. When Rommel took over the inspection of the Atlantic Wall, the first realization was brutal. Most of the defenses had been built for a war that no longer existed. Many bunkers had been designed for a scenario of landings in major ports, where ships would be forced to arrive at predictable points. That made sense in 1940, but it was useless in 1944, when the Allies already mastered the art of mobile amphibious landings, using smaller boats, distributed assault divisions, and flexible strategies that did not depend on a port. Rommel realized that the real threat would not come from large ships, it would come from the sand. That is why he focused his efforts on turning entire beaches into minefields and mechanical infernos. Steel stakes pointed at ships, mines attached to logs, submerged obstacles, networks of crossfire. He ordered thousands of new constructions and immediate reinforcements. He listened to reports from prisoners about Allied capabilities. He spoke with fishermen, civilians, and engineers about currents, tides, and winds. He was obsessed with time, and his obsession revealed another fatal problem. Hitler believed the invasion would only come at high tide and in good weather. That is why he fortified only specific areas, not the entire coast. Rommel said the opposite. An invasion could come at any tide, in any weather. For him, The worst German mistake was trusting prediction more than uncertainty, and there is nothing more dangerous in war than assuming the enemy thinks the same way. Deep down, Rommel understood something that Berlin did not see. No wall works when there is no mobility behind it. A rigid wall is only strong when it matches the aggressor's thinking. The Atlantic Wall did not match. It was slow, fragmented, and built on assumptions. And you already know, assumptions are always the first target of any intelligent army. The second major structural error of the Atlantic Wall was strategic. Hitler believed he could defend the entire coast at once. That meant dividing resources and building thousands of positions that seemed strong on paper, but were isolated, uncoordinated, and without the capacity for quick reinforcement. The Allies spotted this flaw even before launching Operation Overlord. Allied intelligence, with support from the French resistance, reconnaissance planes, and even infiltrated spies, studied the wall for years. They knew where ammunition was lacking. They knew where there was only low-quality infantry. They knew where the concrete was weak and where the mines were poorly distributed. Hitler believed the Allies would never discover the wall's true strong point. But the secret was that they never wanted to attack the strong point. Military engineering does not seek the impossible, it seeks the fragile point. And that point was Normandy. While Calais received the heaviest defenses, the best cannons, and the most powerful armored units, Normandy was treated as unlikely. Sand with cliffs. Non natural port precisely for that reason. It would be the chosen point. The success of D-Day did not begin at dawn on June 6, 1944. It began years earlier, when the Allies turned the wall into a map full of cracks. The German defenses were impressive, yes, but they were static. And history teaches something simple. Every fixed fortress is vulnerable to an attacker who thinks in motion. When D-Day arrived, the Atlantic Wall did not fall due to a lack of weapons, but due to a lack of flexibility. The Germans had hundreds of artillery pieces, gigantic naval guns, radars, MG-34 and MG-42 machine guns, capable of decimating entire companies. But all that power was shackled by a chain of command that depended exclusively on Hitler. Armored troops and mobile reserves could only be released with direct authorization from the Führer. That meant that, when the invasion began in Normandy, panzer divisions were stalled waiting for orders that did not arrive. A wall does not fail only when it is torn down. It fails when it does not react. While German soldiers fought on the beaches, their mechanized units waited for communication by telephone, radio, or messenger. And Hitler devoutly believed that the attack in Normandy was a feint, that the real landing would come days later in Calais. So he kept his tanks where he thought it most logical. The problem is that war is not logic, it is adaptation. While the bunkers in Normandy were swept away by naval bombardment and coordinated infantry assaults, most of Germany's power remained parked hundreds of kilometers away. The wall was not made to be adjusted, but to resist. But resistance without adaptation is just organized death. The true Allied victory was not just crossing the beach, it was suffocating a structure so rigid that it could not move when fate demanded. The failure of the Atlantic Wall also came from a deep psychological error. Hitler believed that engineering and fear were enough to replace experienced men. Many of the soldiers defending the coast were veterans of the Eastern Front, exhausted, wounded, or unable to fight as before. Others were static units, made up of young recruits, forced Soviet posts, or second-rate troops. The wall had the concrete, but it lacked the elite. Rommel realized this immediately. He said the only moment to defeat the Allies was on the beach, in the first minutes of the landing. After that, it would be too late, but the High Command did not believe in. Hitler still dreamed of decisive battles, with armored forces crushing the enemy in open fields. It was an outdated vision. Modern war was not about waiting for the enemy, it was about anticipating him. When the landing began, many German positions were taken by surprise, because their commanders had been forbidden to react without higher orders. The wall became a prison for its own defenders. And that reveals an eternal principle. No fortification is stronger than the mind that controls it, and the mind that controlled the Reich at that moment was already disconnected from reality. The enemy expected the world to obey his predictions, and the world never obeys pride. The Atlantic Wall failed for another unexpected reason. It was deceived. The Allies created one of the greatest disinformation operations ever conducted. Operation Fortitude. They used rubber tanks, fake radios, invented messages, phantom divisions, and even the legendary General George Patton as leader of a fictional army. While Calais was flooded with false information about an imminent attack, Normandy was left in the background. The Germans were seeing ghosts and believing in them to complete the deception. Allied meteorologists chose the perfect date at a point where the weather seemed impossible for an invasion. Hitler slept in on D-Day morning because he thought the conditions made an amphibious operation unreal. While he rested, more than 156,000 soldiers were crossing the Channel. The great German myth collapsed, not because of brute force, but because of intelligence, weather forecasts, and psychological reading. The greatest wall built in modern warfare fell because its creator feared the wrong enemy. And when fear is pointed in the wrong direction, the fortress becomes vulnerable to a silent blow. That of surprise. Even when the German defenses were working perfectly, there was a bigger problem. The Allies had something the Atlantic Wall could never contain: industrial logistics. The wall was built against the idea of invaders arriving in small waves. But the Allies brought to Normandy the greatest combined power ever assembled. Warships, bombers, amphibious tanks, paratroopers, combat engineers, medics, radios, fuel, ammunition, and supplies. While the first minutes were bloody, especially at Omaha, after every Allied advance, new units landed, creating an unstoppable human and mechanical avalanche. Every meter conquered received more men and machines. The wall was static. The Allies were dynamic. The difference is mathematical. A fixed defense always loses to an attacker that multiplies. While a bunker can only fire in one direction, an army can decide where to attack, when to attack, and with what force to attack. The wall was crushed not because it was weak, but because it was unchangeable. And modern war does not forgive what does not change. When D-Day ended, the Atlantic Wall was broken not completely, but at the most important point. In German belief, the symbol of invincibility had vanished. Troops crossed the beach, tanks climbed cliffs, cities were captured. Rommel was right. The only chance of victory was to stop the invasion in the first hours. When that did not happen, the wall ceased to be a barrier and became just occupied terrain, until the Allies advanced into the interior of France. From that moment on, every bunker that had cost tons of concrete and months of work became irrelevant. The Allied armies pushed the enemy front kilometers inland, and the Reich's greatest fortification turned into a museum of defeated iron and stone. The victory that day was not just military, but symbolic. It proved to the world that no system based on fear is indestructible. The Atlantic Wall failed because it was built on three illusions: that the enemy would obey German logic, that static power could defeat movement, and that arrogance could replace strategy. Hitler believed he could draw the future with concrete and cannons, but the future is drawn with adaptation. Rommel saw the error, but he was ignored. The wall was grand, but it was never intelligent. Its failure is an eternal lesson. No fortification is immune when facing an adversary that thinks. No armor is invincible when it becomes a monument to its own confidence. In the end, the Allies did not just win a coast, they won the idea that fear and propaganda could replace experience and planning. And the sound of the failure of Hitler's greatest fortification echoed throughout the war. Fortifications do not win battles. Men and decisions do. And when war demands movement, those who remain static are defeated before the first bullet. If this story made you see World War II from a different angle, decisions that change the fate of nations, 10 pre-meta, why in 8 day? Ask you one simple but powerful thing. Subscribe to the channel now. This helps us continue bringing deep, strong narratives that don't appear in school books. Every subscriber strengthens this mission to keep alive the memory of those who fought and who wrote history with courage and strategy. Hit the button, turn on notifications, and come with us to discover what the war taught the world and why these lessons